Imagine, for a moment, that you stand on the precipice of your promised land. Victory is within reach, yet deep within, the desert still lingers. There's a weariness, a persistent doubt, a gnawing guilt. Haunting decisions replay in your mind, accompanied by a deep-seated fear of failing once more. Has this ever happened to you? It's a shared human experience. It happens to so many of us. It's precisely there, at the boundary between what was and what could be, that a particular feeling takes root. Are you familiar with the book of Deuteronomy? It's not just an ancient legal text, not a cold recitation of commandments. It's the voice of a loving guide, Moses, addressing the hearts of his people one last time as they stand poised to begin a new chapter. It's as if God is looking directly into your eyes, saying, "Do not move forward without remembering who you are and without choosing the right path. For the greatest suffering is not a single fall. The suffering comes from repeating the same cycle, from approaching a new stage with the same broken heart, the same lingering fear, the same disobedience disguised as mere habit." But here's the solution Deuteronomy offers, with incredible force. It speaks of a memory that heals, a truth that orders, and a calling that awakens. You will discover how God transforms the past into invaluable lessons, how He turns your mistakes into warnings that protect you, and how He teaches you to live with a heart that remains steadfast in the face of adversity. Deuteronomy reveals that it's not simply about reaching a destination. It is not just about promises, but about decisions. It's not just about hearing, but about loving God with every fiber of your being. So, if you have ever felt like you're making progress but deep down feel utterly exhausted, if the fear of failing again paralyzes you, stay with me. If you long for a clear sense of serenity and genuine spiritual renewal, stay tuned. This Bible study on Deuteronomy will not merely teach you about a book. It will challenge you on the path of life, and it will demonstrate how to choose that path wisely. Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you won't miss any studies. And right now, write in the comments, "Today I choose life." Repeat after me, "Today I choose life." This doesn't just reveal what God will do in your life. It allows this message to reach more people who desperately need it. The last camp. Moses knows this is the end. Imagine the stark silence of dawn in the desert. It isn't an empty silence, but one pregnant with echoes of years of footsteps, complaints, miracles, hunger, and divine provision. The air itself carries the scent of dust, aged leather, and slowly dying campfires. As the sun begins to send its first rays over the horizon, the Israelite camp appears immense, a sprawling tent city. They are here on the plains of Moab beside the Jordan River facing Jericho. And that phrase, "facing Jericho," changes everything. For the first time in a long, long time, the promise no longer sounds like a distant dream. It's no longer someday. It's no longer when God wills it. Now it's right there, before their eyes, as obvious as a line drawn in the sand, clearly indicating their destination. The Jordan flows before them, a living boundary. It's more than just a river. For Israel, at this precise moment, the Jordan is the gate. On the other side lies the land that God swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The land for which they wept during the long nights in the desert. The land they glimpsed while eating the manna. The land for which they buried so many along the way. And yet, the people aren't fleeing forward in a rush. They aren't celebrating like those who have already won, because something in the air feels different. There is a strange mix of hope and newfound seriousness. It is like when a family finally arrives at the house they always dreamed of. But before opening the front door, they pause, look at one another, and say, "Is this really happening?" Now life begins. Truly, this is where Deuteronomy begins, and here is Moses. Moses is no longer the young and powerful leader he once was. He's a man marked by his journey. A man who saw the Red Sea part, who heard thunder rumble on the mountain, who bore the weight of thousands of people every single day, who interceded for a stubborn people, who wept, who raged, who knelt, and who kept going. Moses looks at the camp and understands that these are not the same people who left Egypt. The generation that witnessed the plagues, that crossed the sea, that trembled before the mountain, that generation is almost gone. Many died in the desert, as God had foretold, because of their unbelief and their rebellion. Now the camp is filled with new faces. Children who grew up hearing the stories, young people whose memories of Egypt are vague, men and women born along the way. And Moses knows this. If these people don't understand who they are, they will lose themselves upon entering, because the desert forced them to depend on God. Every morning, the manna. Every day, a cloud. Every night, fire. In the desert, you can't feign self-sufficiency for very long. But on the land, there will be houses, harvests, wells, cities. There will be stability. There will be routine. And that's where the heart becomes dangerous. Because when human beings feel secure, they start to forget. That is why, before crossing, Moses performs an act that is both deeply human and profoundly prophetic. He gathers the people to speak to them, like a father saying goodbye. Deuteronomy wasn't born from an academic discourse. It was born from an intense, direct, and urgent conversation. It's as if Moses is saying, "Listen to me. Look me in the eyes. I don't want you to repeat our mistakes. I don't want you to miss what God is giving you." But there's something even deeper, something Moses holds in his heart, that makes every word even heavier. Moses knows he won't enter with them. God had already told him, Moses will see the land, but he won't set foot in it. And that hurts. Imagine what that means, to dedicate your entire life to guiding a people toward a promise, and to arrive at the gate only to find yourself outside. Moses isn't telling this story to elicit pity. The Bible presents it as a somber element of the narrative. Even the greatest leader of Israel, the one who spoke with God, is not immune to consequences. And yet, Moses doesn't collapse before the people like someone defeated. On the contrary, he rises as a leader, purer and more determined, more aware that his life was not meant for his own glory, but to fulfill God's will. That's why his voice is so strong, so authentic, so human. Because Deuteronomy is literally the second giving of the law. Moses revisits it, reminds them of it, reorganizes it, explains it, and insists on its application. Not because God has changed, but because the people have changed. Moses is preparing Israel to live without him. That's the point. And when a true leader bids farewell, he doesn't speak to be applauded. He speaks so that those who remain won't self-destruct. The scene then becomes almost cinematic. Thousands of people are gathered. Families with children, elderly people seated, warriors standing, their spears in hand, women carrying water jugs, young people contemplating Moses as one contemplates a living legend. And Moses at the forefront, carrying the weight of history on his shoulders, but with a firm voice, beyond the Jordan, farther on, Jericho, beyond that, the land. And Moses, with this blend of tenderness and authority, begins to speak to them. It doesn't start by saying, "You are amazing." It begins by reminding them of this truth. We are here because of God's faithfulness, and not because of our perfection. Because Moses doesn't want them to enter believing they deserve it. He wants them to enter knowing that they are welcome. And that difference changes the heart. Because when you believe you deserve what you have, you become harsh with others. You become arrogant. You become blind. But when you understand that it is grace, you become grateful. You become humble. You stay close to God. And Moses knows that this battle, the battle of the heart, will be harder than any battle fought with swords. Deuteronomy, therefore, begins as the start of a farewell, but also as the beginning of a new stage. The people are faced with this promise. History is in its final phase, and Moses becomes, for the last time, the voice of God for this generation. As if God himself were saying through his mouth, "Before crossing the threshold, remember who I am, and remember who you are." And it is with this sacred tension, promise in sight and God in the air, that the book begins. Because now the moment approaches, and Moses will not allow Israel to enter asleep, distracted, or overconfident. He will awaken their memories. He will awaken their conscience, and he will leave them a legacy more powerful than any sword, the word of God in their hearts. And so, As the vast camp breathes with anticipation, Moses opens his mouth, and the entire desert seems to listen. Remember where God brought you from. The criticism that awakens consciousness. Imagine Moses standing, contemplating this sea of faces. This isn't an ordinary speech. It's the last great lesson before the people cross the Jordan. And the first thing Moses decides to do is neither to give new orders, nor to talk about military strategy, nor to promise them an easy life. The first thing he does is something that seems simple but is profoundly powerful. He awakens their memories. Because Moses knows a truth that runs throughout the entire Bible. When a people forget what God has done, they cease to trust what God can do. Then, in a firm but moving voice, Moses begins the criticism, not as someone reciting dates, but as someone reliving a story so that it burns anew in their hearts. Listen, he seems to say to them, I'm going to remind you where God brought you from. And then, suddenly, the camp is no longer just a collection of tents facing the Jordan. It becomes a theater of memory, as if the desert wind carries echoes of ancient cries, of broken chains, of hurried footsteps in the night. Moses begins with the cornerstone of their identity. Egypt. Egypt wasn't just a place. Egypt was slavery. It was a life without freedom. It was exhausting oneself in labor without owning anything. It was having the feeling that your life belonged to someone else. It was seeing your children grow up in fear. And Moses reminds the people of what God did there, how God heard their cries, how he saw their suffering, how he raised up a deliverer. Although many of those listening weren't present as adults, they grew up hearing these stories around the fire. The plagues, the judgment against the gods of Egypt, the Passover lamb, the blood on the doorposts, the night when slavery was abolished. And Moses isn't telling this story to simply entertain. He tells it to anchor their narrative. Because if Israel is about to enter a land with cities, harvests, and prosperity, the risk is that one day they will say, we did it ourselves. And Moses wants to uproot that idea. You didn't leave of your own free will. You were forced to leave. Moses then evokes the memory of that moment that still seems impossible. The Red Sea. Imagine the people there, running with what little they possess, hearing the chariots behind them, the dust rising, the cries of fear, and before them. There is no road. There is only water. And what to do when trapped between death and the sea. There, the narrative changes its tone. God opens what no one else can open. Moses recounts how the sea parted, how Israel crossed, how the enemy was left behind. It's not just a breathtaking scene. It's a sign. God doesn't just liberate. God opens the way. And then the criticism continues like a current that never stops. The desert. Moses reminds them how they crossed places without supermarkets, without harvests, and without potable wells. Places where, humanly speaking, a people like them could not survive. But they survived because God provided everything. And Moses doesn't let the people forget the details that seem insignificant but that allowed a nation to sustain itself. The manna falling every morning like dew transformed into food, the water gushing from the rock when thirst burned their throats, clothing that didn't wear out over the years like ordinary garments, the cloud that guided by day, the fire that illuminated the night. It's as if Moses is saying to them, do you realize? It wasn't luck. It was benevolence. And Moses then does something that an ordinary speaker would avoid, but that a spiritual leader cannot avoid. He doesn't only remember the miracles. He also brings back memories of wounds. Because Moses' criticism isn't propaganda. It's the truth. He evokes the journey from Horeb, from Sinai, when God led them toward the promised land. He reminds them how God ordered them to advance, and how, along the way, the human heart began to reveal its weaknesses. Murmuring, fear, unbelief. Moses doesn't humiliate the people for pleasure. He vaccinates them against pride. And then, like a father who speaks firmly out of love, Moses relives those moments of tension when the people despaired, when they grew tired of the food, when they doubted God's presence. And every time Moses evokes a fall, his intention is the same. I want you to remember it so that you don't fall into the same trap again. Because there is one thing that Moses understands better than anyone. Israel's greatest enemy wasn't always outside. Sometimes the enemy was inside. the heart that grows cold, the memory that fades, the faith that is replaced by complaint. And that is why this subject of revision is so crucial. Moses forges an identity, and he does so with an idea that runs throughout Deuteronomy. Remember, remember, remember. Don't forget that God chose you, even though you weren't the best. Don't forget that God sustained you when you couldn't sustain yourselves. And you yourselves, don't forget that God has been faithful, even when you haven't been. Imagine the reaction of the crowd. Many have eyes that seem to say, "Yes, that's right." Others remember the stories that their parents told them while weeping. The young feel the weight of an experience they haven't lived directly, but that defines them. Because Moses isn't only speaking about the past, he is preparing them for the future. If Israel enters Canaan without memory, they become like any other nation. Proud, unjust, idolatrous. But if Israel enters with memory, they enter with a mission, to live as the people of the covenant, to reflect God's justice, to be a light among the nations. Moses, therefore, concludes this criticism like someone leaving an indelible mark. What God did wasn't a story, it was a real intervention. And if he already parted the sea, don't even doubt it when you see walls. And at that moment, the subject of them doesn't only inform you, it shakes you because it makes you see something very human. Spiritual memory is the fuel of faith. Without memory, the heart grows cold. Through memory, the promise becomes possible. Thus, with the people once again aware that their story hadn't begun in the Jordan, but in slavery and liberation, Moses leaves them ready for the next step. Because what follows isn't just about crossing a river. It's about learning to live as free men without forgetting the liberator. The moment they almost lost everything. The lesson of Kadesh Barnea. Imagine that after evoking Egypt, the Red Sea, and the desert, Moses pauses, a long silence, as if searching for the precise moment that wounded him the most but that he most needed to share. Because there are memories that we don't recount to turn the page. There are memories that we recount so that they never repeat themselves. Moses then takes them to a place that, in the history of Israel, isn't just a point on the map. It's an open wound. Kadesh Barnea. Hearing this name alone was enough to change the atmosphere of the camp. Because Kadesh Barnea was the place where the promise was within reach and the people retreated in disbelief. Moses looks at this new generation and speaks as if to say, "We were this close, and we ruined everything out of fear. The promise was within reach, and your heart let it slip." Imagine the scene at that time. Israel was returning from Sinai, guided by a clear direction. It wasn't a lost people, but a guided people. They had seen the power of God. They had received the law. The tabernacle stood in the midst of them, and the cloud guided them. And they arrive at Kadesh Barnea, near the entrance to the Promised Land. It was the moment that so many people dream of, the one where you finally find yourself at the door of what God has promised you. But it is precisely there that the people ask for something that seems reasonable. And it is there that the danger appears. They ask to send men to explore the land. God had already declared that the land was good, that he would deliver it, that he would go before them. But the human heart, when it mixes faith and fear, longs to control. 12 spies then set out, one per tribe, and travel the land. They observe it carefully, analyze it, cross valleys, hills, and fertile fields. And they return with tangible proof. Clusters of grapes so large that it takes 2 to carry them. It wasn't a rumor. It was evidence. The land was as God had described it. And for a moment, the camp is filled with anticipation. But it is there that tragedy strikes. The spies bring 2 messages simultaneously. Yes, the soil is good, and that but was like a stone in the chest of Israel. Because most of the spies begin to speak not by faith, but by fear. There are giants, there are fortified cities. In their eyes we are like grasshoppers. And within minutes the entire camp changes. What was supposed to be a celebration turns into panic. And panic, when unchecked, turns into rebellion. Fear becomes contagious. When a voice is frightened by the fort, weak hearts begin to tremble. Caleb and Joshua are voices that never give up, but not everyone spoke like that. 2 men, Caleb and Joshua, rise like a flame in the darkness, and their message is simple, direct, and powerful. Yes, there are, but God is with us. Yes, the land has walls, but God gave it and God promised it. Do not be afraid. Let's go up and take possession. They didn't deny the difficulty. They didn't claim there were no giants or risks. What Caleb and Joshua did was put reality in the right order. God first, then the problem. Because when God is at the center, walls become small. But when fear is at the center, even a grain of sand looks like a mountain. And Moses remembers that the people, instead of listening to faith, submitted to fear. And that's where the most painful part occurs. They start to cry, but not out of regret. They cry because they don't want to move forward. They complain, they murmur, they say things that reveal the depth of their disbelief. I wish we had died in Egypt. Why did God bring us here? Let's go back. Think about it for a moment. A people who saw the sea open wants to return to slavery. A people who ate manna wants to return to chains. Not because Egypt was good, but because fear drove them to prefer the known, even if it was horrible, to what was promised, even if it was glorious. And then arises a phrase that stings because it's so human. Let's find a leader and go back. It's as if they were saying, Moses, we don't trust you anymore. We don't want to follow this voice. There, Moses relives the scene with overwhelming intensity, because he lived it. He saw the people on the verge of self-destruction. He saw how fear can annihilate a nation when disbelief becomes a sentence. And Moses says it clearly. The tragedy of Kadesh Barnea wasn't due to a lack of strength. It was a lack of trust. God had already opened the way. The promise was fulfilled, but the people didn't enter. And then comes the judgment of God, not out of caprice, but as a spiritual consequence. This generation will not enter. It's hard, but it's fair. If they refuse to trust God when they are inches away from salvation, how will they live on the land without turning away from Him? So God decrees that they will wander in the desert until the death of that generation, and only the new generation, the one that didn't participate in that rebellion, will enter. Caleb and Joshua, those who believed, will indeed enter, but those who preferred to return will remain wanderers. Moses pauses at that moment because he wants the new generation to understand something essential. The promises of God are real, but disbelief can make you miss your chance. And imagine the young people listening there. Many, as children, had undoubtedly heard that their parents didn't enter, without ever understanding the reason so clearly. Moses presents it to them like a mirror. You are in the same place again. Don't repeat the same mistake, the belated attempt when pride wants to correct without obedience. And Moses remembers another detail even more revealing of human nature. After God decreed the punishment, the people suddenly say, "Now we will go up." But it was too late. It wasn't obedience. It was pride trying to repair the consequences by itself. Moses warns them, "Don't go up there. God is not with you up there." But they still went to battle and were defeated. And that defeat was a clear message. It's not about doing things, but about doing them with God and in God's time. This point is crucial because Moses teaches something useful for all of life. There are people who say yes when God says go forward too late, and then they want to recover what they have lost, but without humility, without listening, without truly surrendering. And that ends in a fall. The lesson of Kadesh Barnea wasn't the desert. It was the heart. Moses, in evoking Kadesh Barnea, delivers the most important message on this subject. The giants weren't the obstacle. The obstacle was that heart that saw giants bigger than God. Because if God can split the sea, He can also knock down a wall. If God can feed a people in the desert, He can also sustain them in conquest. But if the heart loses faith, even the most fertile lands can no longer be appreciated. And so this memory becomes a living warning. Moses looks at the new generation as if to say, "Here you are at last. The future is promising, and fear will appear too. But this time it's not about checking the quality of the soil. We already know that. It's about deciding if God is worthy of trust." And in the face of this truth, the camp falls silent. Because the story doesn't just tell them what happened. It speaks to their present. It tells them, your destiny may be handed to you, but what determines whether you are admitted or not? It's not the size of the wall. It's the measure of your faith. The discipline of the desert. God doesn't just guide. He also shapes. Imagine that after speaking of Kadesh Barnea, Moses let silence do its work. Because this story isn't only heard with the mind, it's heard with the heart. And when he has led them to introspection, Moses moves to the next stage. As if to say, understand this well. The desert wasn't just a punishment. It was a school. It was a training. It was God shaping a people. And here is the fourth theme, one of the most profound in all of Deuteronomy. The discipline of the desert. God doesn't just guide. He also shapes. The desert wasn't a place. It was a process. Listen, if you think of the desert as sand and heat, you're missing half the message. It's in the desert that God took a group of newly freed slaves and transformed them into a nation. Because leaving Egypt was quick, but removing Egypt from the heart takes time. In Egypt, they lived under the authority of men. In the desert, God taught them to live according to his will. In Egypt, their identity was that of slaves. In the desert, God taught them, "You are my people." And Moses tells them clearly with words that cut like pure truth. God made you go through the desert to humble you, to test you, to know what was in your heart. It sounds hard, doesn't it? But destroying isn't humiliation. Purifying is humiliation because pride is a blindfold over the eyes. Prevents you from seeing reality. Prevents you from depending. Prevents you from learning. And the desert removes the bandages. When you have nothing, you discover how real your faith is. Manna, the daily lesson of dependence. Then Moses leads them to the bread of the desert, the manna. Imagine the scene as if it were today. Early in the morning, the ground is still cool, and when people go out, they see it. That fine, frosty substance. No one sowed it, no one made it, no one bought it. It appeared as if by magic. And people ask, "What is it?" Man who? Meaning asterisk, what is it? And God tells them to collect each day what they need for the day, no more and no less. Because God could have provided for their needs for a month. He could have generated enough manna for years. But no, God designed the manna as a daily lesson. Trust me today. Tomorrow I will be there for you again. For many it was awkward, because the human heart likes to accumulate things to feel safe. And God in the desert taught them that true security doesn't lie in accumulated possessions, but in the faithfulness of the one who provides. And Moses remembers him as a teacher. God gave you manna to make you understand that man doesn't live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. That phrase is brilliant because it doesn't say that bread isn't important. Of course, it is. It says that bread isn't the most important thing. The most important thing is the word, the voice, the direction of God, because you can have bread and still be lost inside. But if you have the word of God, you have a path even when you don't have bread. The real challenge wasn't the shortage, but the heart. Moses insists on a point that many only understand too late. The desert wasn't difficult solely because of what was missing. It was difficult because of what it revealed. In the desert, what was hidden was revealed. Impatience, mistrust, complaints, idolatry, hardness. And there, Moses doesn't hide it. He doesn't try to embellish reality. He says, "Yes, we failed." But that also reveals something even more important. God didn't abandon them. That's the scandal of grace in the desert. A stubborn people, sustained by a faithful God. And Moses remembers details that seem insignificant but are gigantic when you think about them. Their clothes didn't wear out, their sandals didn't break. 40 years of walking, and yet God sustained them. It's not just a practical miracle. It's a message. If God sustains you in difficult times, He can also sustain you in good times. Because in prosperous times, the danger changes. It's no longer a complaint regarding a lack. It's the pride of abundance, the desert as a remedy against pride. And there, Moses raises his voice as if he wants to save men from themselves. When you enter a house and have one, when you eat and are satisfied, when you have flocks, silver, and gold, beware lest your heart become proud. Moses paints a scene of the future. Israel in the promised land, living well, prospering, building cities. And one day, Someone says, I am strong, I am smart, I did well on my own. And Moses, with all the authority of one who has seen history, stops them. No, remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you the strength to acquire wealth. That's the essential point. God didn't just want to bring them to the land. He wanted to bring them to the land with a holy heart. Because if they arrived with a sick heart, the land itself would become ruin. The desert, then, was like a surgical operation for the soul. Painful, slow, but necessary. God as a father, a discipline that shapes and doesn't humiliate through cruelty. Moses affirms it through a direct comparison. As a father corrects his son, so the Lord your God corrects you. That's very important because it changes your perception of the desert. God didn't treat Israel as an enemy. He treated them as a son. And a loving father doesn't let his son grow without correcting him, because he knows that it will destroy him. The desert, therefore, was a correction. Yes, it was a consequence. Yes, but above all, it was a training. God taught Israel something that isn't learned through fine speeches, but through real life. Obey when it's difficult. Trust when you don't understand. Move forward when you don't see the end of the tunnel. Conclusion of Theme 4. The desert was the crucible where a nation was forged. And Moses, in recalling all of that, expresses something that transcends the centuries. The desert wasn't your end. It was God's workshop. Because, in the end, Israel didn't arrive in Moab as the same people who left Egypt. They arrived more conscious, more mature, more pronounced. And now, before the Jordan, Moses leaves them this truth like a torch in their hands. If God sustained you in the desert, don't doubt Him on the land. And that's how the camp begins to understand that the greatest miracle of the desert wasn't the manna, or the water, or the cloud. It's that God took a broken people and shaped them to fulfill His design. And now, with that lesson engraved in their hearts, Moses is ready to take them to the next stage, the most important of all. Listen to God and love Him with all your being. The central theme of the book. Listen, Israel, and the call to love God. Imagine that after speaking of the desert as a school, Moses changes his tone as if he had guided the people through the past, Egypt, the sea, Kadesh Barnea, their year of training, and he now places them before what is most important. Not the land, not the walls, not the conquest, but the heart. And Moses then pronounces words that, when they come out of his mouth, don't sound like a simple speech. They sound like an oath, like a flame that must burn forever. Listen, Israel! And at those words, the atmosphere seems to become heavier, because Israel understands that it isn't a simple phrase. It's a central call, the spiritual heart of the book, the very essence of their identity. Here is Theme 5, the central theme of the book. Listen, Israel, and the call to love God. Listening isn't just hearing. It's surrendering. The first thing Moses says is listen. And here is something that many people don't understand. In the Bible, hearing doesn't just mean that the sound enters through the ear. It means obeying. It means paying attention with the soul. It means letting the word govern you. When a father says to his son, listen to me well, it isn't so that he repeats his words, but so that he puts them into practice. Moses, therefore, doesn't ask for silence out of respect. He asks for an inner act. Israel, open your heart, because what I'm going to say will define your life. And then comes the declaration. The Lord our God is one Lord. That's enormous. In the midst of peoples who worshipped many gods, gods of the sun, of rain, of war, of fertility, Moses erects a truth like a mountain. There is only one true God. There isn't a God for every problem. There isn't a God for every season. One, the one who brought them out of Egypt, the one who separated the sea, the one who fed them in the desert. It's as if Moses were saying, your life isn't broken into 1,000 pieces. Neither is your God. And then, just after indicating who God is, Moses directly addresses what God wants. Love. And here is a striking point. At the heart of the covenant, God doesn't just ask for a ritual. He asks for a relationship. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. Not with just one piece, not just when it suits you, not just in the tabernacle either. And Moses says it that way because he knows one thing: obedience without love becomes an empty religion. But true love engenders true obedience. Loving God isn't a feeling. It's a way of life. Imagine now how that sounds to the people. Many come from slavery where everything was obligation. Others come from the desert where the priority was to survive. And Moses explains to them that life with God isn't just about fulfilling obligations. It's about love. But loving God in the Bible isn't just saying, "I love you," with your mouth. It's about choosing Him. It's about trusting. It's about obeying even when it's difficult. It's about placing God above fear, above pride, above the desire to fit in with the nations. In other words, love is faithfulness. And that's where Moses brings that truth back to daily life. Because he knows that great words are vain if they aren't put into practice. That's why he says, "These words will remain engraved in your heart, not just on a cold stone, not on a parchment kept at the bottom of your heart," as if to say, "I don't want this to be a religious ornament. I want this to be your way of thinking." And Moses then becomes even more specific. "You shall teach them to your children." And that's essential, because Moses understands that faith that isn't transmitted weakens with each generation. These people are going to enter a country where children will grow up seeing harvests, festivals, cities. And if they aren't taught anything, they will think that all of that is normal, that they earned it by their own means. Moses, therefore, places faith at the center of the family, at home, on the table, in conversation, in the child's questions. Why do we do this? Why do we worship God? Why don't we do like the other peoples? And Moses says, that's where the future is formed. God in daily life, sitting, walking, lying down, getting up. Moses then paints a magnificent scene, almost like a rhythm of life. You shall talk about them when you are at home, when you walk on the road, when you lie down, and when you get up. When you are in a normal situation, when you are tired, when you travel, when you work, when you are with your children, when you are alone, because God doesn't want to be just a Sunday moment. God wants to be the foundation of all life. And that has a considerable impact on an adult audience because it speaks of something real. We all live with thoughts in us all day long. And Moses says, let the word of God be the dominant thought. The danger that Moses is fighting is forgetting God when everything is going well. But Moses doesn't say that solely out of spiritual emotion. He's fighting a specific danger related to the promised land. When people live well, they can start to love other things more than God. Loving comfort, loving wealth, loving the approval of others, loving power. And that's when the heart is divided. That's why the Lord is one isn't just a theological formula. It's a warning. If God is one, your heart can't be divided. Because a divided heart ends up breaking. Moses insists, therefore, it's not just about believing in God. It's about loving Him above all else. Visible signs, reminders that prevent you from sleeping. And here are the images that Moses gives. Bind the words as a sign on your hand, as frontlets between your eyes. Write them on the doorposts of your house. Not as if by magic, but as a reminder, as if to say, surround yourselves with reminders, because the world will make you forget. And that's profoundly human, because we all forget what we don't nourish. We forget the promises. We forget the lessons. We forget what saved us. That's why Moses makes faith something that is seen, said, repeated, and taught. The heart of theme 5. Love as the key to everything. Thus, in this 5th chapter, Moses moves away from the heart of Deuteronomy. God doesn't want a people who simply obey. God desires a people who love Him. Because if you love Him, you obey Him. If you love Him, you don't sell yourselves to idols. If you love your neighbor, you treat them well. If you love Him, you won't lack anything when abundance arrives. And the camp listening begins to understand something profound. The promised land isn't the final reward. The reward, ultimately, the goal is to live with God. And the gateway to that life isn't fear, brute force, or even towering intellect. It's unwavering, faithful love. That's precisely why Moses began by saying, listen, for whoever listens with their heart learns to love, and whoever loves learns to truly live. Imagine, after proclaiming, listen, O Israel, and speaking of the love of God with every fiber of his being, Moses doesn't just let this profound truth hang in the air like some pretty, ephemeral sentiment. No, Moses understands a fundamental truth about human nature. If the love of God doesn't translate into concrete action, the human heart is easily deceived. It says, "I love God, but I live as I please." Therefore, Moses acts as a wise and seasoned guide. He makes spirituality accessible, tangible, and real for everyone in the camp. And this brings us to topic 6. The law reinterpreted not to chain you down but to order your life, to set it on the right course. The law isn't a cage. It's a carefully charted path. You see, so many people hear the word law and immediately conjure up images of something restrictive, something that limits and suppresses freedom. But Moses presents a radically different perspective. He looks out at the people, their faces etched with years of hardship and uncertainty, and says, in essence, this isn't about destroying your lives. It's about protecting them, nurturing them, and allowing them to flourish. For Israel isn't just going to wander aimlessly in a desert devoid of structure. They're about to settle in a land teeming with life, with thriving cities, bustling marketplaces, well-worn roads, clearly defined property lines, inevitable conflicts, lurking temptations, and potential injustices at every turn. And without clear, divinely inspired guidance, this newly formed nation will quickly descend into utter chaos. Moses, therefore, re-explains the law, but with a very specific purpose, that Israel might learn to live as a nation under the unwavering protection of God. It's as if to say, when you cross the Jordan, you won't merely be surviving day to day. You will be building, you will be establishing families, you will be loving one another, and you will be reaping the fruits of your labor. And it's there, in that moment, that we see if they truly believe. From mere emotion to concrete obedience, love is demonstrated, made real, and put into practice. Moses doesn't separate love and obedience. He inextricably unites them. After saying, "You shall love the Lord your God," Moses revisits an idea that runs like a lifeblood throughout the entire book of Deuteronomy. Keeping his commandments not as a form of punishment, but as the natural, overflowing consequence of genuine love. For if you truly love God, you won't willingly choose to live in opposition to him. Moses explains it as someone teaching a child to walk. This will be good for you. This will prolong your days. This will protect you. This isn't a do this, or I'll crush you. It's a do this and you will thrive. You will truly live. The law as an instrument of justice, do not distort it. Do not twist it to your own selfish ends. And it's here that Moses addresses some incredibly practical matters, because he understands that the greatest danger to a society doesn't begin in grand, sweeping gestures. It begins in the small, seemingly insignificant things, in acts of petty corruption, in blatant favoritism, in silent, insidious injustice. That's why he insists on something that seems simple on the surface, but is absolutely crucial for the life of a nation. Do not pervert justice. Do not accept bribes. Do not idolize the powerful out of fear. Do not crush the weak out of convenience. In other words, be different. For Israel wasn't simply called to possess a territory. It was called to reflect the very character of God. And God is just. Therefore, if Israel becomes unjust, it betrays its very identity, its divine calling. Moses makes it unequivocally clear. The law isn't just about the temple. It's also about the courts, social life, and everyday interactions. A nation that forgets justice ultimately destroys itself from within. The law as a protection for the heart. Do not revive the idols, do not reinstate slavery. But Moses also reminds them that the law is an invisible wall against idolatry. For the surrounding communities had their own practices, their own rituals, their own normal customs. And many of these customs were steeped in violence, exploitation, and spiritual deceit. Moses wants Israel to understand with every fiber of their being. If they become mixed, they will be lost. That's why the law makes distinctions, not out of pride or arrogance, but for the sake of preservation. Like a loving father who says to his son, "Don't go down that path, for it will destroy you." The very order of life, family, work, relationships, words, and Moses, in representing the law, addresses these essential aspects. The respect for parents, for instance. For a society that doesn't respect authority inevitably descends into chaos. It's true because lies destroy trust, and without trust, there is no community. Purity in relationships is paramount. For betrayal shatters families, and a people without strong families is weakened at its very core. Beware of greed, for it transforms your neighbor into a mere object, a means to an end, and not a person created in the image of God. Moses teaches a timeless lesson that remains profoundly true today. Life crumbles when the heart loses its boundaries, and the law is the boundary that protects both the heart and others. The law and the power of memory. Remember that you were slaves. Now here is a very important point. Moses doesn't just repeat the law as a collection of cold, detached rules. He always connects it to a deeper, more resonant reason. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That changes everything. Because Israel doesn't obey in order to earn God's favor. Israel obeys because it has already been saved, marvelously and miraculously delivered from bondage. It's as if Moses is saying, God has shown you mercy beyond measure. Now, in turn, show mercy to others. Then the law becomes human, it becomes compassionate, it becomes a tangible reflection of the very grace they themselves have received. And that's why Moses insists so vehemently. Because a people who forget their past sufferings become hardened to the suffering of others. And God didn't want a hardened Israel. He desired a just and merciful Israel. The law isn't a useless burden. It is life itself. Moses uses language that almost resembles a promise, lowered down for your own good because he knows that people can fall into two dangerous extremes. 1. Ignoring the law as if it were utterly useless, and 2. Fulfilling it as if it were a mechanical, loveless exercise. Moses wants neither of those things. He wants sincere obedience, an ordered yet spiritual life, a nation that possesses both a strong structure and overflowing compassion. That's why Deuteronomy doesn't sound like a rigid set of rules. It sounds like instructions for surviving spiritually in a time of abundance. Closing topic 6. I am not restraining you, I am preparing you. And at the end of this section, the feeling is clear. Moses is not chaining the people down. He is building a solid foundation. For freedom without direction inevitably leads to chaos, while freedom with God becomes a powerful and purposeful force. So, in reaffirming the law, Moses says, they will enter a prosperous land, but if they want to remain there, conquest alone won't be enough. They must change their way of life from the inside out. Thus, the people find themselves facing a truth that carries a heavy weight, but also provides unwavering protection. The law is not the enemy of life. The law is the path that allows you to keep your life in harmony with God. And now, armed with these solid foundations, Moses prepares them for the next great danger that awaits them in Canaan. Not just armed enemies, but idols that subtly seduce the heart. Imagine that after presenting the law as a way of life, Moses does something incredibly human. He lowers his voice slightly and increases its intensity. For some warnings aren't shouted like a general on the battlefield. They're spoken like a father who intimately knows the hearts of his children and knows precisely where they are most likely to stumble. And Moses knows precisely where Israel faces its greatest danger when crossing the Jordan. It won't just be the enemy armed with a sword. The enemy will slip in through the eyes, through ingrained habits, through what seems normal. This is where topic 7 comes into play. Purity and worship, the inherent danger of mingling with idols. The true battlefield isn't outside. It's within. Moses looks toward the future, and it's as if he's seeing scenes that the people cannot yet even imagine. Israel entering fortified cities with bustling marketplaces, alluring music, pagan festivals, opulent temples on hillsides, priests of other gods, rituals that promise prosperity, protection, and fertility. And Moses knows that the human heart has a dangerous weakness. When something seems to work, we are often tempted to imitate it. They have abundant harvests, but what if their God is stronger than ours? That's how they celebrate. What if that brings good luck? They worship images, but what if it's easier than obeying? And on this point, Moses is crystal clear. Idolatry doesn't always begin with open rebellion. It often starts with a subtle mixture, a small concession, an excuse, it'll be all right. That's why Moses doesn't address this issue at the end. He places it at the very heart of the matter. For he knows that if Israel loses the purity of its worship, it will inevitably lose everything else. Do not imitate. Moses sets a clear boundary even before the temptation arises. Moses tells them firmly, "When you enter the land, do not learn to imitate the detestable customs of those nations." Look closely at the word learn, for Moses understands that the heart learns. It develops habits. It internalizes what it sees and experiences repeatedly. Learn languages, learn customs, develop new skills. But if you repeatedly expose yourself to something, it eventually becomes normal. And Moses says, do not normalize what God detests, even if the world calls it culture. And then arises the brilliant idea, Israel must be different, not because they are inherently better, but because they have been set apart. Why are idols so incredibly dangerous? Because an idol is a lie cloaked in a beautiful form. Promises what only God can truly give, but it demands your very soul as payment. Moses isn't talking about statues as if they were simply a matter of decoration. He is talking about a dangerous spiritual replacement, where people cease to trust the invisible God and begin to seek control in visible, tangible things. And idolatry invariably leads to two destructive things. 1. False security. If I perform this ritual, everything will be all right. And 2. Moral corruption. For when the God is false, life itself becomes distorted. That's why Moses insists on an essential point. Worship isn't just a religious act. It is the very driving force behind your behavior. You love something, and you inevitably end up resembling it. Temples on hillsides, the seductive temptation to do things my way. Moses warns them against pagan places of worship, a hill, a forest, a temple, pillars, images. For these places possessed a powerful draw. They were quick, easy, and convenient. They didn't demand holiness. They didn't require obedience. They didn't demand justice. They only required a ritual. And the human heart, when it grows weary of doing what is right, inevitably seeks easier paths. Moses then tells them to utterly destroy these temples. Do not keep them around just in case. For Moses knows a fundamental truth about human nature. What you don't eliminate will eventually seduce you. And that sounds harsh, but it's undeniably true. If you keep the idol, one day you will look at it. The more you examine it, one day you will end up tolerating it. If you tolerate it, one day you will begin to embrace it. If you embrace it, one day you will serve it. Do not make any images, for God cannot be contained in your hands. Moses insists that Israel must not create images for worship, because an image inherently diminishes God. It turns him into something you can control, that you can carry around, that you can move, that you can place wherever you please. But the God of Israel is not a manipulatable force. He is the Lord. He is holy. He is alive. Moses is therefore protecting the people from a dangerous mental trap. When you transform God into an object, you inevitably transform faith into a mere spectacle. And that's where the authentic relationship dies. Respectful fear is extinguished. Obedience fades away. Do not consult the darkness. When seeking counsel from harmful, unreliable sources, Moses also warns them against practices that were common in Canaan: divination, sorcery, enchantments, consulting the dead. Not because Israel was inherently curious, but because fear drives human beings to desperately want to know the future. In times of uncertainty, we seek shortcuts. And Moses says, your guidance will not come from the darkness. It will come from God. For God doesn't want a people dominated by superstition. He desires a people dominated by unwavering trust. And here is a very modern lesson, even though it is ancient. When the heart loses trust in God, it begins to seek to control him by any means necessary. The heart of the problem is that the heart becomes divided and ceases to be faithful. Moses isn't saying, don't live with anyone. In reality, Israel was going to live surrounded by other peoples. The warning isn't social. It is fundamentally spiritual. Do not mix in worship, because you can live alongside others without adopting their ways. You can establish relationships without abandoning your own identity. But if Israel adopts the gods of Canaan, its identity will dissolve. And Moses knows that once the people are spiritually mixed, there are no longer any clear boundaries. There is no longer any real difference, and then injustice seeps in like water. Corruption takes center stage. Cruelty emerges from the shadows. Abuse becomes rampant. For when the true God leaves the center, what enters in its place isn't freedom. It is utter disorder. Moses speaks to them as someone who has already witnessed the catastrophic fall of the human heart. Moses isn't improvising. He had already witnessed what happens when people are distracted. He saw it with the golden calf. He observed it in their constant murmuring. He considered it a profound act of rebellion. That's why his warning isn't theoretical. It is based on lived experience. It's as if Moses is saying, I know that you might be thinking, we would never do that, but you already have. And here is a phrase that the book of Deuteronomy hammers relentlessly. Take care of yourself. Be careful not to forget. Be careful not to imitate. Be careful not to stray. Pay close attention because the heart strays, often in silence, subtly and insidiously. Purity of worship. It isn't about fanaticism. It's about spiritual survival. Therefore, Topic 7 isn't about being strange or peculiar out of pride. It's about surviving as the people of God. For if Israel crosses the Jordan and changes its worship, it will wander astray. And if it wanders astray, it will eventually lose its territory, its calling, and its very soul. Moses is giving them a map of the danger zone long before they even encounter it. And that is the truest form of mercy. Conclusion of Topic 7. If you truly worship God, you won't need to imitate anyone. Moses leaves the people with an idea that resembles both a sword and an embrace. The strength of Israel doesn't reside in its resemblance to other nations, but in its unwavering belonging to God. For when God is at the center, you don't need idols to feel safe. You don't need rituals to control the future. You don't need to copy others in order to prosper. You don't need to mix styles in order to fit in. All you need is unshakable loyalty. So, as the promised land comes into view and temptation looms large on the horizon, Moses imparts a simple truth to the people, a truth of deadly gravity. If Israel loses the purity of its worship, it will lose its very identity. But if Israel remains faithful, God himself will be its refuge, its protector, and its enduring strength. And fortified by this warning, the journey continues toward the next vital stage. For Moses now wishes to teach them something essential. They must not only avoid idols, they must also learn where and how to worship the true God in unity and with a shared purpose. If what you are listening to speaks to your heart, do not let this opportunity slip away. Subscribe right now if you haven't already done so. Share this video with someone who is going through a difficult time, and tell me what you think in the comments. I will read them all. Every comment and every interaction helps this message reach more people who need guidance and hope today. Imagine that after warning against idols, Moses doesn't just say to the people, "Don't do that." For God isn't just a God who forbids. God is a God who guides. And Moses knows that the human heart needs direction, not just limitations. It needs to know to what point it must return when temptation strikes. It needs an anchor, a compass, a place that constantly reminds it. Here is God. Here is the covenant. Here is remembrance. This is where Topic 8 comes into play. The place that God will choose, spiritual unity and meaningful worship. When everyone practices their religion in their own way, faith inevitably becomes disorganized and diluted. Moses observes the people and understands a very real danger. If Israel enters the land and each family decides to practice its worship as it sees fit, wherever it wants, according to its own rules in a short amount of time, the worship will become mixed, clouded, and will eventually resemble paganism. For that's how the human heart functions. Without direction, it invents. Without a center, it scatters. That's why Moses says something that marks an enormous difference between Israel and the surrounding nations. They will seek the place that the Lord, their God, will choose, and there they will bring their offerings. Look closely. The place that God will choose. Not the place that seems beautiful to you, not the place that is close to you, not the place that makes you feel something. This is essential. For biblical worship isn't based on momentary emotion, but on unwavering obedience and the covenant relationship. Moses establishes a truth that will sustain Israel for generations. Worship needs a center so that the people do not divide from within. A spiritual center isn't under human control. It is under divine protection. Some might wonder why only one place, but Moses presents it as a form of protection. In Canaan, temples could be found everywhere, hills with shrines and mystical rituals that attracted with curiosity. Practices promising rapid benefits abounded. So God, knowing our inherent nature, says, I will choose one place, and there they will seek me, not to limit the encounter with him, but to prevent the people from falling into the confusion of 1,000 voices. For those places and methods of worship often end up worshiping anything and everything. Moses wants Israel to have a clear point of reference, a point where faith is ordered and renewed. Imagine the scene. Different tribes, one shared heart. Think about what this means for Israel. There are 12 tribes, each with its own unique character, history, and pride. If each tribe becomes spiritually independent, the nation will be divided. This chosen place is therefore also an act of unity. It's as if God is saying, you are not 12 peoples, you are one. So, when they go to the chosen place, they are not simply performing a ritual. They will be remembering together. They will be celebrating together. They will be looking at each other and saying, we are still the people of the covenant. Offerings, tithes, and first fruits. It's not about paying God. It's about showing him our gratitude. Moses speaks of bringing burnt offerings, sacrifices, tithes, voluntary offerings, and the first fruits. And here is an important point. In Deuteronomy, these things are not presented as a religious tax. They are presented as a declaration of the heart. God is the owner of everything. I am simply a steward. When a man brings the first fruits, he is saying, before I gratify myself, I honor God. And this is profoundly countercultural because human beings normally do the opposite. They first ensure their own security, and if there is anything left over, they think about God. But Moses teaches a life lived in reverse. God first, then everything else. For when God comes first, the heart is not hardened by wealth, and you shall rejoice. Worship is also a sacred feast. And Moses adds a precious detail here, joy. He says that in this place, people will eat before God and rejoice with their families. This refutes the idea that biblical faith is absolute seriousness devoid of joy. No, Moses teaches that true worship also includes celebration because God did not merely command them to obey. He saved them. Therefore, worship includes gratitude, and gratitude begets joy. Imagine families traveling, parents carrying their children, the elderly walking slowly, young people singing psalms along the way, animals for sacrifice, baskets of fruit, bread, and wine, all with the feeling, we are going to meet God. It's incredibly powerful because during these celebrations, the people are healed from their amnesia. Don't forget that you were not born by chance. You were born from a promise. Take care of the Levite, the foreigner, and the weak. Worship that forgets no one. But Moses does not consider worship a selfish event. He recalls a central point of Deuteronomy. In the midst of the feast, do not forget the Levite, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan. For, to God, worship is not just raising your hands. It's how you treat those beneath you. Moses is building a complete vision. A chosen place, a united people, joyful worship, and a community that includes the vulnerable. In other words, a sect that forms a just society. Don't do what you think is right. Moses also says something that seems strong. They shall not do as we do here, everyone doing what seems right in his own eyes. Why does he say this? Because in the desert, life was different. It was a transitional phase. But on the land, in a situation of stability, each tribe could become its own kingdom in the absence of direction. So God says, you are now going to enter a phase of maturity. It's no longer about surviving, but about establishing yourselves at the center. Moses prepares a change of mentality from survivors to the established city, from the camp to the nation, from improvisation to method. And this spiritual order begins with the place chosen by God, the heart of theme 8. A city remains alive when it has a center. In essence, Moses saves Israel from a future of fragmentation. For he knows that without spiritual unity, faith disperses, the tribes separate, customs mix, idols enter, and the covenant weakens. But with a center chosen by God, the people retain their identity, and each pilgrimage to that place becomes a rebirth of the heart. It's as if God were telling them each time, "Come back. Remember, adjust your cloak, don't get lost." Conclusion of Theme 8. Meaningful worship, unity guided by a specific purpose. Thus, Moses leaves a clear image in the people's minds. When they cross the Jordan, the danger will not only be losing battles but also losing their hearts. That is why God will choose a place not out of caprice, but out of love, so that Israel has a center, so that the covenant remains valid, so that worship has meaning, and so that even in abundance the people do not forget what is essential. They did not reach the land by their own strength. They came thanks to God's faithfulness. And now, with this vision of unity and ordered worship, Moses prepares them for the next step. For if there is to be a center of worship, there must also be something more. An organized society where justice guides its decisions, where leaders are accountable, and where the most vulnerable are cared for. Imagine that Moses has already clarified two fundamental points before crossing the Jordan. First, do not consort with idols. Second, have a center of worship, a place chosen by God. And here now is the step that completes the vision. For Moses knows that a people can sing, celebrate feasts, offer sacrifices, and yet be unjust in real life. One can have religion and at the same time crush the weak. One can talk about God and mistreat their neighbor. And that, for God, is a contradiction. Moses then addresses Theme 9 as if opening a door to daily reality, saying to them, in essence, if you want to be the people of God, your faith must manifest itself in how you treat others. This is where Theme 9 comes in. Social justice at the heart of the nation. The poor, the foreigners, the widows, and the orphans. A society is judged by how it treats those who cannot defend themselves. Moses looks at the people and reminds them of something he never wants them to forget. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. This phrase is not a sentimental memory. It is a bulwark against cruelty. For the human heart, when it rises to a higher position, runs a huge risk, that of forgetting what it was like to be at the very bottom. And Moses says, Israel, if God delivered you from oppression, do not become oppressors when you have power. This is serious because Israel is about to enter a region where there will be properties, fields, harvests, and commerce. There will be rich and poor. There will be conflicts. There will be temptations to take advantage of the most vulnerable. And Moses does not want Israel to imitate the system of nations where the strong command and the weak remain silent. God wants a different society. The poor are not a burden. They are your responsibility before God. Moses speaks of the poor with direct clarity. If there is anyone in need, do not harden your hearts. Do not close your hand. Do not say, it's not my problem, because, for God, it is your problem. But notice how Moses presents it not as a cold obligation but as an act of faith. Helping those in need is declaring, I trust God to provide for my needs and not my own reserves. For when a person becomes greedy, it's deep down that they are afraid. The fear of losing, the fear of not being up to it, the fear of not having a tomorrow. And Moses combats this fear through spiritual teaching. Be generous, for the God who fed you with manna can also feed you on the land. Loans and debts. Economic justice imbued with humanity. Moses addresses a delicate subject, loans, debts, years of remission. And this is where we see the character of God. God did not want his people to live prisoners of an eternal cycle of misery. That is why he establishes principles so that poverty does not become a permanent condemnation. Moses even warns them against a calculating spirit. Do not say to yourselves, deep inside, the year of remission is approaching. It's better that I don't lend. For that would be using the law to justify the absence of mercy. Do you see the depths? It's not simply about doing this. It's about protecting one's intentions because God's justice is not only legal, It is moral. It comes from the heart. The employee paid fairly and expected. Moses then addresses a subject that seems simple but changes lives, the salary. He says not to withhold the payment of the day laborer. He should pay them on time because that worker lives from day to day. Their food depends on that payment. Their children depend on them. And Moses affirms it with profound truth. If you do not pay them, they will implore God, and God will hear them. That shows something impressive. God takes the side of the exploited worker. God takes the side of the downtrodden. Israel could not be the people of God and at the same time be unjust in its work. Faith had to manifest itself in the marketplace, in the fields, in the harvest. The foreigner not to be regarded as a threat. Regard them as a person. Moses then designates the foreigner, and this is very important because it's the foreigner who had no social network, no extended family, no inheritance, no tribes to defend them, vulnerable. And in many ancient societies, the foreigner was treated with suspicion or as an inferior being. But Moses says the opposite. Do not squeeze them, do not mistreat them, because Israel was also a foreigner. Israel also lived in foreign lands. Israel also knew what it was like to be the one who doesn't feel like they belong. Moses develops an empathetic heart. He teaches, do not judge people according to whether they are yours. Judge them according to the value that God gives them. The widow and the orphan, the moral thermometer of the people. And here is the point that runs through the entire Old Testament, the widow and the orphan. In that world, a widow could find herself without protection and without resources. The fatherless orphan found himself defenseless and without inheritance. They were easy prey for abuse. Then God, through Moses, places these people at the center of social protection. It is as if he were saying, if you take care of those whom no one else takes care of, you show that you belong to me. Moses establishes specific practices. During the harvest, do not pick up every last grain. Leave some grain for the poor, for the foreigner, for the widow, for the orphan. Do not exploit the land as if it were there only for profit. Make room for mercy. This is impressive because it transforms the economy into compassion. The harvest becomes an act of worship. It's not just about production. It's about justice. Remember memory as the driving force of mercy. And Moses constantly returns to this phrase, which serves as his anchor. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Why does Moses repeat this so often? Because it is memory that prevents the heart from hardening. When we remember our own pain, we do not laugh at that of others. In remembering your rescue, you do not humiliate the one who needs help. When we remember how God treated us, we treat others the same way. Moses builds a nation founded on memory. For a people without memory becomes cruel without realizing it. Social justice is not politics. It is an alliance with God. It is important to understand this. Moses does not speak as a modern activist. He speaks as a prophet of the covenant. For him, social justice is part of faithfulness to God. You cannot separate the two. You cannot say, I worship God, and then exploit the poor. You cannot say, I love God, and then despise the foreigner. You cannot say, I am a saint, and then ignore the orphan. For the God of Israel is not only a God of the altar. He is the God of life. Closing theme 9. A different nation, a different heart. Thus, Moses leaves this subject as a mark on the soul of Israel. When you enter the land, do not measure yourselves by the number of cities you conquer. Rather, measure yourselves by how you treat those who cannot defend themselves. For that is where we see if God truly reigns. Thus, the people understand that the Promised Land is not just a place where it is good to live. It is a place where it is good to live and live justly. With these foundations strong, Moses prepares the next step. For now that the nation is going to be established, it will also need rules for difficult times, conflict, wars, decisions of leaders, ethics in situations of pressure, and how not to lose its soul. Imagine that the people are listening to Moses and that, inwardly, many feel something like this. I understand. God wants a just, faithful, and compassionate people. But what about when the pressure is on? What about when there are threats? What about when there is war? For talking about justice in a camp is one thing, And it is equally important to keep one's heart pure when the drum of battle resounds, when fear extinguishes you, when the enemy is before you, when your life seems threatened. Moses knows this. And so, after speaking of the poor, the foreigners, the widows, and the orphans, Moses opens theme 10 as if to say, "We have now spoken of what happens when the nation must fight without losing its soul." This is where subject number 10 comes in: war, leadership, and ethics. Fighting without losing your soul. War is approaching, but God does not want a savage people. Moses is not naive. He does not promise a future without conflict. Israel will enter a land where kingdoms, fortified cities, armies, alliances, and violence already exist. There will be clashes. There will be tensions. There will be resistance. And Moses understands an immense danger. When a people go to war, they can justify everything. They might say, "It's a matter of survival," and use that as an excuse to become cruel. They can say, "It's for victory," and lose their humanity. But Israel was not called to be a people like any other. Israel was called to be a people under the authority of God. And that means that even in times of war, their ethics could not die. Moses, therefore, teaches something that seems simple but is very profound. The way you fight reveals whom you love. Do not be afraid. The battle begins in the heart. Moses begins with a principle that runs through the entire Deuteronomy. When they go to war and see horses, chariots, and a larger army, do not fear, because fear is the first enemy. Fear drives you to make bad decisions. Fear makes you lose faith. Fear drives you to idolize power. Moses then reminds them that he brought them out of Egypt. In other words, if God delivered you from the greatest power of that time, do not think that it now depends on you. And here a very important figure appears: the priest. The priest was to address the army and tell them that their hearts must not fail. The Lord, your God, is with you to fight for you. This is impressive because it shows that Israel does not fight only with weapons. It fights with confidence. But beware, trusting does not mean being irresponsible. It means not losing your balance. It means that war must not make you someone without fear of God. Order within the army. Even in times of war, humanity exists. Moses also establishes rules that seem unexpected in a military context. For example, it offers certain men the opportunity to avoid going to combat: the one who has built a new house and has not yet inaugurated it, the one who has planted a vineyard and has not yet profited from it, the one who is engaged to a woman but has not yet married, and also the one who is fearful so that he does not spread fear. This reveals something. God does not regard men as disposable objects. God takes life into consideration, considers the heart, thinks of the family. He also takes into account the spiritual effect of fear on individuals. Moses says, "The battle is not just about strength. It is also about spirit, peace before destruction." Condition of offer. Moses teaches that when Israel approaches a city to fight it, it must first offer it peace. This is wonderful, for in many ancient societies, war was a brutal impulse. Arrive, devastate, dominate. But God, through Moses, puts an end to it. First, offer peace, because Israel was not called to love violence. It was called to love God. And a people who love God do not take pleasure in destroying. War, when it exists, must have limits. It must be ordered. It must have a purpose. It must not excuse cruelty. Protect creation even in times of war. Do not destroy the fruit trees. And here is one of the most striking images in Deuteronomy. Moses says that when they besiege a city, they must not destroy the fruit trees. For the tree of the field is not a man, that you should besiege it. Do you realize? In the midst of war, God speaks of trees. This reveals the character of God. Even in times of judgment and conflict, there is a vision of life. Do not destroy things in anger. Do not destroy impulsively. Think about the future. Think about the land. Think about the fact that you are going to live there. This teaches self-control. Teaches self-control. It teaches that unlimited power leads to senseless destruction, responsible leadership, decisions that weigh heavily before God. Moses also speaks of leadership because, in times of tension, The nation needs direction. Judges, officials, tribal chiefs, elders, all were to act with justice and fear of God. They could not take advantage of the war to steal. They could not use their authority to humiliate. They could not manipulate the people with lies. For leadership without fear of God becomes tyranny. And Moses prepares Israel so that its structure is strong from within. A nation can win battles and yet decompose from within. Moses does not want that. He wants a nation that displays victory on the outside and holiness on the inside. Fighting without losing your soul. The ultimate goal. So what does Moses do in this chapter 10? He teaches something enormous. Israel, even in times of war, must remain Israel. It must remain the people of the covenant. It must continue to reflect God. For the real danger does not lie only in losing a battle. The real danger is winning the battle and losing your heart. It is about coming out victorious and then becoming cruel. It is about conquering cities and becoming an idolater of power. That is why Moses establishes limits, rules, ethics. For God does not want a strong but empty people. He wants a strong and just people. Final point number 10. The enemy does not always come from the outside. Moses leaves a striking impression. Yes, they will have enemies on the outside, but if fear and cruelty take root on the inside, the enemy will be on the inside. That is why he teaches them to fight with order, with humanity, with obedience. With this message, Moses prepares the next step. For after having spoken of war and leadership, there is something that will inevitably appear in the history of Israel. One day they will ask for a king, and if power is no longer controlled, the nation will disintegrate. Moses is, therefore, now going to advance as a prophet to speak of the future king even before the people ask for him. Imagine that Moses has already spoken of war, of fear, of leadership, of how to fight without losing your soul, and that he then does something that only a man guided by God dares to do: speak of the future. For Moses knows that history is not fixed. He understands that when Israel settles in the Promised Land, life will change. They will no longer be a camp guided by a cloud in the desert. They will be a nation with cities, borders, commerce, enemies, and political decisions. And in this scenario, sooner or later, people will turn around and say something that seems reasonable but is incredibly dangerous. We want a king like the other nations. Moses sees it coming, and that's why he opens the subject in chapter 11. Like someone triggering the alarm before the fire even starts, he knows that the future king, when he comes to power, must not steal hearts like the other nations do. He foresees this desire, seemingly normal, but ultimately destructive to their identity. Imagine the future scene, even though Moses has described it in advance. Israel, already settled in the land, living in cities, cultivating the soil, developing, and seeing the neighboring peoples with their kings, their thrones, their standing armies, their crowns, and their highly visible palaces. And the human heart, when it sees this, is tempted. We need that too to be strong. We also need a man to represent us. We also need someone to lead us. The allure of earthly power begins to take root. But Moses wants them to understand something essential. Israel already has a king, not a human king but the Lord. The problem isn't organizational. The problem resides in their deepest motivations. Asking for a king like everyone else isn't just a matter of politics. It's a shift in worship. In other words, we no longer want to depend on God in this way. We want a visible power. Moses knows this is where the downfall of many nations begins, when human power takes the place of God. Moses doesn't forbid a king. He constrains him to obedience. What's impressive in Deuteronomy is that Moses doesn't say, "They shall never have a king." He knows that day will come. But what he does do is establish the framework, like someone building a cage for the lion before releasing it into the city. Moses says, when they say, "I will set a king over me," make sure it's the one God chooses, not the one the idolatrous people choose. Because if people choose based on appearance, strength, or charisma, they'll end up following a crowned idol. And Moses wants a king who is submitted to God, not a king who pretends to be God. He identifies 3 potential snares of power: horses, women, and riches. Here, Moses becomes surgical. He names 3 things that destroy kings from the inside. He shall not multiply horses. He shall not multiply wives. He shall not multiply money and gold excessively. This isn't a random list. It's an X-ray of the heart. Horses represent military power, confidence in human strength, and dependence on armies. Wives represent political alliances, disordered desires, a divided heart. Riches represent pride, false security, and corruption. In other words, Moses is saying, when you have power, you must not become a slave to what power offers. For power doesn't only govern individuals. It can also govern the one who wields it. Don't return to Egypt. Don't return to the mentality of slavery. Moses even mentions Egypt here. Don't return to Egypt to buy horses, because Egypt symbolizes human dependence, a system of oppression, and imperial pride. It's as if Moses is saying, God brought you out of Egypt. Don't go back in through the door of power. What an expression! Because there are people who leave Egypt with their bodies but return with their hearts, seeking security in the same old things. Moses doesn't want that for Israel. The most dangerous king isn't the one who loses battles. It's the one who believes he's superior. And here is the heart of chapter 11. Moses says that the king must not place his heart above that of his brothers. In other words, the king can't look down on his people as if they belong to another species. Because in the covenant, all are under God's protection. The king is a leader, yes, but he remains, first and foremost, a brother. He is still part of the community. He remains responsible before the Lord. This is radically different from the kingdoms of the ancient world, where the king was almost divine. God says, in my city, power doesn't make you a god. It makes you a servant. The key that keeps everything in place? The king must write the law and read it. And here is one of the most shocking commandments in all of Deuteronomy. The king must make a copy of the law for himself and read it every day of his life, so that he may fear the Lord, keep his commandments, and not deviate to the right or to the left. Imagine the scene. A king with a crown, but a scroll in his hand. A king who reads before speaking, who consults the word before deciding, and who submits before acting. That's what Moses is trying to protect. Leadership under divine authority. Because when the king stops listening to God, the people are lost. And Moses knows this. The ideal king is strong in appearance but humble on the inside. So what does Moses do here? He creates a different definition of greatness. Greatness isn't acquired through armies. Greatness isn't acquired through wealth. Greatness isn't pleasure. Greatness isn't domination. But greatness is obedience, fearing God, remaining humble, and not letting power steal your heart. Because the true king, according to God's design, isn't the one who sits highest. It's the one who bows deepest before the Lord. If the power reaches you, don't let it change your soul. And Moses concludes this subject with a warning that sounds like both a prophecy and a remedy. Israel, when you have a king, don't make him an idol, and don't let him become a tyrant. For the history of Israel will show that when the king deviates from the law, the nation divides. But when the king submits to God, the people prosper. Thus, before crossing the Jordan, Moses sows this idea. Power isn't bad. The worst thing is a heart without restraint. And the journey continues. Because if there are kings and leaders, there will also be a need for something more. A voice to correct the king when he goes astray. A voice that rises in the name of God when power seeks to silence the truth. And that's where Moses addresses the next subject. The prophets. Chapter 7. The promise that God will raise up someone like Moses. Imagine that, after talking about the future king, Moses remains silent for a moment because he knows what accompanies the reign of kings. He knows that power is seductive. He knows that pride grows quickly. He knows that people get used to obeying a man and, without realizing it, stop listening to God. And Moses, who has carried the burden of being the voice of God for Israel, understands a question that many may not even dare to ask, but which hangs in the air. And when Moses is no longer here, who will speak to us? That's where chapter 12 comes in. And it is one of the most prophetic and hopeful passages in all of Deuteronomy. the prophets and the voice of God. I will raise up someone like you. Israel cannot live without the voice of God. Moses observes the people and understands that their greatest need is neither military, nor economic, nor political. Israel's greatest need is spiritual guidance. For a nation without the voice of God is guided by its emotions, its fears, its trends, and its interests, and ends up getting lost. And Moses reminds them of an essential point. In neighboring nations, people seek guidance in everything. Fortune tellers, sorcerers, enchanters, mediums, mystical signs, omens. Why? Because human beings cannot bear uncertainty. But God says to Israel through Moses, "You shall not seek guidance in the darkness. I myself will speak to you." And that is where the figure of the prophet appears, not as a fortune teller of the future, but as a messenger of the living God. The prophet is the mouth of God in the midst of the people. Moses explains that God will raise up prophets from among them. Not strangers, not magicians, not sellers of promises, but men called by God who will say what God tells them to say. And this is important. The prophet doesn't say what suits him. He doesn't say what people want to hear. He says what God commands. Sometimes it will be comfort. Sometimes it will be correction. Sometimes it will be a warning, but it will always be a living word. Because God loves his people too much to let them walk blindly. I will raise up someone like you. The promise that transcends generations. And Moses then pronounces words that sound like an arrow launched into the future. The Lord your God will raise up for you, from among your own people, a prophet like me. You must listen to him. Imagine the impact of that sentence. Moses is saying, God will not be finished speaking when I die. God will not abandon his covenant in silence. God will raise up someone like me. And that gives birth to hope. Because Moses wasn't an ordinary leader. He was the mediator, the one who spoke with God, the one who received the law, the one who guided the people. Therefore, the promise of a prophet like Moses is immense. It's as if God is saying, just as I guided them through Moses, I will also guide them by my word in the future. And later, throughout biblical history, this promise becomes a guiding thread that many will remember until they find its fulfillment. Why does God promise prophets? Because power needs to be corrected. Understand this well. Moses has just spoken of kings, and kings by nature tend to surround themselves with people who applaud them. They tend to silence uncomfortable voices. They tend to justify themselves. So what does God do? He raises up prophets. Voices that cannot be bought with gold. Voices that do not bow before the throne. Voices that stand before a king and say to him, "Thus speaks the Lord." This is a blessing because it means that even if Israel has a king, the true king remains God. And the prophet is the living reminder of this reality. Discernment. How do you know if a prophet is true? But Moses also knows that where there is the word, there will also be counterfeiting. Some people will say, God spoke to me, when in reality, they are only seeking power, money, and influence. Moses then gives them clear instructions, because God doesn't want a manipulated people. First, the true prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and not in the name of other gods. Second, if the prophet says something and it doesn't come true, it doesn't come from God. And Moses says it clearly, do not be afraid of him. In other words, don't idolize him. Don't submit to the lie. Don't let a false message control you. It's mercy because it teaches people not to be naive. Don't believe just any voice. Let's not forget that the word of God is holy. The essence of the prophet is to bring the people closer to God and not to himself. In essence, Moses prepares the people to make this distinction. The false prophet draws people to his own figure. The true prophet brings people back to God. The false prophet sweetens sin to make it acceptable. The true prophet confronts sin to heal it. The false prophet promises an illusory peace. The true prophet announces true peace, but with repentance. That is why the prophet is not a spiritual decorator. He is an instrument of correction and hope. This promise has a purpose. God will continue to walk with his people. And here is the most beautiful thing in chapter 12. God does not leave Israel an orphan. Just as he brought them out of Egypt, Just as he sustained them in the desert, just as he led them to the edge of the Jordan, he will also accompany them on the land. How? With his word, with your address, with prophets who will speak when the people go astray, with prophets who will remind the nation of the covenant when it forgets it, with prophets who will know how to rekindle hope when everything seems dark. And above all, with this powerful promise, I will raise up someone like you. It is as if Moses, in pronouncing these words, peacefully renounces the baton of command because he understands that human leadership is temporary, but the voice of God is eternal. It is the voice that saves a nation from silence. Moses then leaves the people with a certainty that sustains them. When I am no longer here, God will continue to speak, and that is life. For a nation can have kings and still be lost, but a nation that listens to the voice of God, even if it goes through crises, even if it is at war, even if it knows exile, there is always a way to return. And with this subject launched, Moses prepares them for the most intense passage in the entire book. For after speaking of prophets and guidance, comes the moment when God confronts the people with a brutal decision. 2 paths, 2 destinations, blessing or curse. Imagine that after speaking of prophets, of the voice of God in the midst of the people, Moses fixes Israel with a serious look that cannot be feigned because he is no longer telling stories from the past. He is no longer explaining general principles. He is now coming to the point where all this teaching turns into a decision. Like when someone looks you in the eye and says, "Okay, you understand, now choose." That's where chapter 13 comes in, blessing and curse. The moment to choose one's soul in one's hands. It's not a threat in the air. It's a warning about spiritual life or death. Moses knows that some people hear blessing and curse and think that God is capricious, as if he were saying, "If you obey me, I will reward you. If you don't obey me, I will punish you." But Moses presents it differently as a real consequence, walking with God or turning away from him. For God is the source of life. If you approach the fountain, you drink. If you distance yourself, you dry up. It's not magic. It's reality. That is why this moment is so intense. Moses doesn't want to scare people through manipulation. He wants to wake them up before it's too late. They're hues, a city about to cross, and a decision more important than a river. Imagine the people before the Jordan. The land is there. The promise is there. But Moses says to them, the most important thing is not to cross the river. The most important thing is to cross it with a pure heart. For Israel could conquer the land and still lose its soul, could win battles, build houses, reap harvests, and end up destroyed internally if it turned away from God. Moses then traces 2 paths for them, not 3, not a mixture. From there, and he does so in a tone that almost resembles a solemn judgment. If you obey, you will receive blessings. If you disobey, you will suffer curses. Blessing, when life aligns with God, everything falls into place. Moses describes the blessing as a chain of life. Blessed in the city and in the countryside. Happy your arrival and your departure. May your family, your harvests, and your livestock be blessed. May your work be blessed. May your stability be blessed. And you see, it's not that there will never be any effort. That's not the blessing. It's that life ceases to struggle against God. When a people lives in alliance, God sustains them, protects them, opens paths for them, gives them wisdom, brings them peace, and strengthens them. Moses even speaks of victory over enemies, not because Israel is invincible by itself, but because God fights for a people who belong to him. And here is an important detail. The blessing also includes reputation. Moses says that the nations will see that Israel is called by the name of the Lord, and they will be afraid. In other words, when Israel lives in accordance with God, its life becomes a testimony. It's not just about prosperity. It's about a visible identity. The curse, when you turn away from God, what seems solid collapses. Moses then changes his tone. And here you can feel the weight of it. For the curse is not limited to having problems. It is the progressive decline of a life disconnected from God. Moses speaks of confusion, frustration, dryness, being defeated, sickness, oppression, hunger, and loss of stability. And the hardest part is that it speaks of falling into the hands of the enemy, of being scattered, of living without peace. It's as if Moses is saying, if you remove God from the center, the nation will not be able to hold. It will collapse. For this pact was not just a simple ornament. It was the foundation. Without a foundation, the house collapses. Why does Moses describe the curse in so much detail? Because the human heart is skilled at justifying its disobedience. Human beings deceive themselves. They say, everything is fine. They say, God doesn't care. They say, I'm in control. Moses breaks this illusion. He shows them the end of the road before they take it. It's like when a father says to his son, don't go near the edge, or you'll fall. Not because he wants to control his son, but because he loves him. And Moses loves the people, even if they gave him headaches, even if they defied him, even if they made him cry. Moses loves them and doesn't want them to self-destruct. That is why he describes the curse without softening it, so that the decision is conscious. It's not that God hates you. It's that you have disconnected yourself. This point is crucial. Moses does not present the curse as divine cruelty. He presents it as the consequence of the rupture of the pact. For when you turn away from God, you lose the thread, you lose your limits, you lose justice, you mix with idols, you become corrupted from the inside, and in the end, what seemed to be a strength turns into weakness. The curse is the total disorder that occurs when a nation abandons the voice that sustains it. The moment of choice, I put before you life and death. And that is where Moses reaches the culmination of his emotion. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. It is amazing, for Moses does not speak only as a legislator. He speaks as a prophet and as a father. He says, I have already seen what happens when the heart rebels. I have already seen the tombs of the desert. I have already seen how fear made them back down. I have already seen what disbelief destroys. Now please choose life. And in Deuteronomy, life is not limited to breathing. Life is being connected to God. Life is walking with Him. Life is obeying Him. Life is surviving. This decision is not only about ancient peoples. It concerns you today too, and here is the strongest part. This moment does not look like ancient history. It looks like a mirror. For every person at some point is confronted with this same crossroads. Obey or negotiate, trust or control, remember God or forget Him abundantly. Moses says, essentially, the paths seem similar at the beginning, but the end is completely different. The covenant isn't a game. It's a path to destiny. Moses concludes this section laying bare his heart. I cannot cross for you. I cannot decide for you. Cannot love God for you. I can only present to you the truth, and the truth is this: obedience leads to life. Disobedience leads to ruin, not because God is capricious, but because God is God, and humanity was created to live in accordance with His ways. Thus, facing the Jordan, the nation understands that the most difficult crossing isn't the river itself, but the crossing of the heart. And with that, Moses leads them to the next stage. The renewal of the covenant, this solemn moment where all the people stand before God to seal their identity before Moses takes his leave. Forever. Imagine, after placing life and death, blessing and curse before the people, Moses doesn't let this moment hang in the balance. He knows that the most powerful words can be lost if they aren't sealed. Here, Deuteronomy takes on the air of solemn ceremony. Yet at the same time, it is profoundly human. It's not an empty ritual. It's as if God were saying, stop. Look at me, listen. Today you decide who you are. That brings us to subject 14, covenant renewal. Today you stand before the Lord. Today, when faith ceases to be history and becomes a present decision, Moses uses a word that strikes hard today. It isn't written someday. It doesn't say, when it suits you. It doesn't say, when you're ready, but today. Because Moses knows that faith is lost when it's always postponed. He also knows that Israel stands at a unique turning point. The land is a step away, and at the same time, a step away from repeating the mistakes of the past. So Moses has the whole people stand before God as before a mirror that does not lie. And what's impressive is that Moses doesn't just summon the important people. He calls everyone. The scene, An entire nation gathered, with no one hiding behind. Imagine that image because it is powerful. Their leaders, the authorities, their elders, those who carry the memory. Its officers, those who administer. All the men of Israel, the heads of households. Your children who don't yet understand everything, but who are being trained. Their wives who sustain the families and the future. The foreigner who is in the middle of the camp, who may not be born Israelite but who is under the people's covenant. Even the one who cuts wood and the one who draws water. The simplest, those who don't speak in public but who ensure daily life. It's as if God were saying, in my covenant, no one is invisible, no one is left aside. And that has incredible power. The renewal of the covenant isn't a decision of the elites. It's a national decision, because a nation endures when its faith isn't just that of its leaders, but that of its entire people. Moses remembers the covenant as a living alliance and not as a simple piece of paper. Moses explains to them that they are there to enter into the Lord's covenant to confirm the oath that God made to their father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But notice, Moses doesn't speak as if the covenant were an ancient document signed and preserved. He speaks as if it were a living bond, like a spiritual marriage, as a covenant that defines identity. So Moses says, it's not just a question of religion, it's a question of belonging. And here's the detail that will make your heart tremble. God renews his covenant with the new generation, not just with those who lived in Egypt, but with those who were born on the way, with those who listened to stories, but who must now make their own decision. For no one enters into God's design by automatic inheritance. True faith is received, but it's also chosen. Warning: a heart can turn away in silence. Because Moses knows the human heart, he launches a solemn warning, that there be among you no root that produces poison and bitterness. Moses knows that danger doesn't always manifest as open rebellion. Often, ruin begins with something hidden. A heart that cools, a form of minor and tolerated idolatry, a hidden sin, a bitterness that doesn't stop growing. Moses describes it almost as a poisonous plant that, if not uprooted, contaminates the entire field. That is, if only one person withdraws, they can drag many others into their fall. It's quite real, for rebellion doesn't remain the preserve of a single person. It is contagious. That's what happened in the desert. That's what could happen on land. So Moses protects the people from internal corruption. The word is near. It's not impossible. It's not inaccessible. Moses now counterbalances this warning with hope. For if he leaves only fear, the people will be paralyzed. Moses then pronounces something precious. The command is not far. It is not in the heavens so that you say who will lie, nor beyond the sea, so that you say who will go. It is almost that in your mouth, in your heart, so that you conform, you realize it. Moses says, God doesn't ask you to do something inhuman. He shows you a practical path. It's not an impossible mystery. It's not a spirituality reserved for an elite. It's daily life with God. It's a constant choice. It's obedience step by step, a renewed covenant before the crossing. Because the heart must cross first. Here is the central point. Before crossing the Jordan on foot, Israel must cross it with its heart. For if they cross it with a divided heart, the land will swallow them, prosperity will harden them, idols will seduce them, alliances will corrupt them. But if they take the step with this renewed covenant, the territory becomes the stage for a divine plan. Moses prepares a spiritual reset, a moment of clarity, a today that will shape the future, to choose life. Moses presents them again with the decision, but this time no longer as a theory, but as a sealed covenant. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. It sounds like a plea, like a father pleading, like a man who knows these days are coming to an end and wants only one thing, to leave the people alive through God. And the people, hearing him, understand that this covenant isn't a religious ornament. It's the path that sustains generations. Today you stand before the Lord and that defines you. Once this section is complete, the feeling is overwhelming. Israel is not simply a nomadic people who finally found a land. Israel is a covenant people, a people who have memory, a people endowed with law, a people who have the power to decide. And Moses states something dizzying clearly. You won't be able to say, I didn't know. You won't be able to say, "It wasn't me." Today you stand before the Lord.